Russia is now pushing weapons into Iran at extraordinary speed through the Caspian Sea, not offering contracts, not discussing payment structures. The term used by the New York Times in its explosive report published this morning was far more urgent: racing. A single word that reveals the pressure inside Moscow's calculations. It suggests a leadership convinced the clock is running out, and that every shipment must arrive before the operational window slams shut. Drone systems, missile components, and air defense equipment are reportedly moving south from Russian territory into Iranian ports across the Caspian route. That path bypasses nearly every enforcement mechanism built by the American sanction structure and the naval containment effort. Geography itself has become the loophole. The Caspian Sea is landlocked. Russia controls the northern side. Iran controls the southern edge. American carrier groups operating in the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea cannot physically block that corridor. The USS Abraham Lincoln, the George H.W. Bush, and the Gerald R. Ford cannot intercept vessels inside those waters. Marine VBSS teams that have spent this conflict boarding ships and redirecting cargo traffic have no reach there. Even the 57 vessels CENTCOM has already forced away from Iranian ports in the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea are irrelevant to this route. That makes the Caspian a strategic blind spot inside the enforcement architecture. And according to the New York Times report, Moscow has now chosen to exploit that weakness at maximum speed. None of this emerged from nowhere. This pattern has existed from the beginning. Before the war erupted, Russian attack helicopters had already been transferred into Iran. Those aircraft were later used against Iranian civilians during the protest waves that unfolded before the conflict escalated. People died in the streets under fire from helicopters supplied by Moscow. Then the war began. Russian aircraft started entering Iranian airspace, carrying cargo Moscow, publicly described as humanitarian assistance. But questions quickly surrounded what was actually inside those planes. Significant evidence suggests the shipments included shoulder-fired manpads, portable heat-seeking missile systems small enough for one individual to carry, weapons capable of being hidden beneath a bed, leaving no radar signature that separates them from ordinary objects until the second they are launched. The loss of the F-15E Strike Eagle during this conflict changed the analysis entirely. Intelligence assessments examining the engagement geometry reportedly concluded the aircraft was likely not destroyed by a conventional Iranian integrated air defense network. Instead, evidence points toward a Russian-supplied manpad, a shoulder-launched, heat-seeking missile operated by a single individual positioned in an area outside the American suppression targeting package. The danger was not a radar installation, not a missile battery, not an organized defense grid. It was one person carrying a launch tube, a battery unit, and an infrared guidance system. Everything required for that attack had allegedly been supplied by Russia under the cover of a humanitarian transport. That F-15E and the crew aboard it became the human price of Moscow's covert weapons pipeline into Iran, while publicly maintaining the language of neutrality and humanitarian aid. Now, according to the latest reporting, Russia is accelerating those same deliveries again: more drones, additional missile parts, expanded air defense capabilities, all moving through the Caspian corridor during the ceasefire period in preparation for what may come next. The purpose appears unmistakable. If the war reignites at full intensity, Tehran must enter the next phase with stronger capabilities than it possessed during the first round of fighting. The 8 white aircraft observed above Zanjan on May 8th suddenly fit into a much clearer picture. When those planes first appeared, analysts assessed they were likely Russian or Chinese due to their flight patterns, their lack of national markings, and the timing of their presence over Iranian territory during active military operations. The following morning, the New York Times report confirmed Russia was using the Caspian Sea route to transport military supplies into Iran. That revelation retroactively strengthened the earlier open source assessment. 8 unmarked Airbus variant commercial airframes, Iranian skies, a functioning Caspian logistics corridor, Russian military shipments underway. The pattern aligns, and the operational objective appears increasingly obvious: rearm Iran during the ceasefire, ensure the IRGC regains the drone capabilities, missile components, and defensive systems damaged during the first stage of Operation Epic Fury. Now the central strategic question moves directly onto the table inside American planning circles. What exactly does Washington do if Russia continues rebuilding Iran's military capability through the Caspian corridor? Direct military interception is effectively unavailable under the current rules of engagement. Shooting down Russian aircraft or seizing Russian shipping inside the Caspian would cross an entirely different escalation threshold than anything the United States has executed during this conflict so far. Destroying Russian supply aircraft means attacking Russian aircraft directly. That changes everything. Such an action would trigger a response framework involving a nuclear power rather than the already degraded capabilities of the IRGC. The White House has spent this conflict carefully controlling escalation boundaries. Entering direct combat with Moscow falls outside those operational parameters, regardless of how provocative Russia's actions may appear. But another option remains on the table. Instead of striking Russian assets directly, the United States could target the Iranian infrastructure receiving the shipments. If weapons are entering through Caspian ports, then those ports themselves become potential objectives. Airfields where the unidentified aircraft landed could also become targets. Warehouses storing Russian-supplied systems before redistribution to IRGC operational units may already be under surveillance for future strike packages. Those facilities sit on Iranian territory, and American strike architecture operating throughout this war already possesses the capability to hit them. That raises a new operational mystery. Why has that targeting not yet happened? There are several possibilities. Intelligence agencies may still lack precise confirmation regarding the exact delivery sites required for successful strike execution. Diplomatic concerns surrounding facilities connected to Russian supply operations may also be slowing the decision-making process. Or perhaps the policy determination has already been finalized, and the targeting packages are simply being prepared for the next campaign phase. Yet the most significant detail inside the New York Times report may not be the supply route itself. It may be the timing. The word racing changes the entire analytical framework. Russia is rushing weapons into Iran during a ceasefire because Moscow appears convinced the available window is closing rapidly. That urgency suggests a specific assessment inside the Kremlin. The pause in fighting may not last long enough for slow logistics operations. Racing implies a deadline. Russia's actions indicate a belief that Tehran has only a short period remaining to receive, distribute, and operationalize these systems before the conflict potentially erupts again. That conclusion also reshapes how analysts interpret the ongoing diplomatic track. Publicly, the United States continues emphasizing negotiations moving through Qatar and Pakistan. Marco Rubio's statement from Italy indicated Washington expected Iran's formal response to the 30-day bridge mechanism by the end of May 9th. But if Moscow is accelerating weapons shipments at emergency pace during the ceasefire itself, then Russia's own assessment of the timeline may be revealing something deeper. The Kremlin appears to believe the diplomatic clock is running out. The accelerated movement of Russian weapons through the Caspian Sea reveals something deeper than logistics alone. It signals Moscow's own judgment about the diplomatic negotiations now unfolding behind closed doors. If the Kremlin believed a settlement between Washington and Tehran was truly within reach, there would be no urgency. There would be no race. That frantic pace itself becomes the message. By moving military supplies southward at maximum speed, Russia is effectively communicating that it views the diplomatic track with deep pessimism. Moscow does not appear interested in a lasting agreement. Its strategic interests are better served by an extended confrontation that traps American military power inside the Middle East for as long as possible. A prolonged conflict drains American precision-guided munitions stockpiles. It forces production demands beyond what the current defense industrial base can rapidly replace. At the same time, it keeps Washington's strategic attention fixed away from Europe, precisely where Russia's campaign in Ukraine is facing mounting pressure and operational deterioration. For Moscow, preserving the IRGC-dominated Iranian state carries enormous value. Iran provides Russia with a regional strategic partner. It remains an important client weapons market. Its geography places it beside critical global energy infrastructure that Moscow needs to remain central within worldwide economic calculations. Russia is therefore not functioning as a neutral participant in these negotiations. It is an invested power whose institutional objectives benefit directly from the continuation of war. The military cargo crossing the Caspian is not humanitarian relief. Those shipments are designed to strengthen Tehran's ability to resist the American framework while simultaneously increasing the financial and military cost imposed on Washington and its allies. That outcome aligns perfectly with Russian strategic priorities. Then comes the Israeli assessment, and that layer transforms the situation from a bilateral American-Iranian negotiation into a broader regional calculation involving multiple states. According to Channel 12 News in Israel, Israeli officials believe the probability of a successful agreement with Iran remains extremely low. Jerusalem has reportedly informed Washington that if the conflict resumes, strikes against Iran's entire energy infrastructure must occur within the opening 24 hours. Several Arab governments are also said to support the same operational approach. This does not represent Israel opposing the American diplomatic effort. Instead, it reflects Israel outlining the conditions under which it would participate in a renewed military campaign during a second operational phase. The focus on energy infrastructure within the first day reveals Israel's assessment of what would actually create decisive pressure, instead of producing another temporary pause, followed by Iranian reconstitution. Earlier in April, before the ceasefire was established, Donald Trump had already threatened to target bridges, power facilities, and energy sites across Iran. Those threats were never carried out. Once the ceasefire began, the diplomatic opening effectively froze every target category that had been prepared for possible strikes. Now, Israeli officials are reportedly arguing that if the ceasefire collapses and hostilities return, those energy-related targets cannot remain in reserve as later escalation tools. They must become the opening blow. The logic behind that position is brutally simple. A blockade campaign designed to pressure the Iranian population may require 3 to 4 months before severe economic hardship produces institutional crisis conditions. But a concentrated air assault against energy infrastructure generates massive economic shock in only 24 hours. The difference is not merely intensity, it is speed. A blockade slowly squeezes the system over time. Energy strikes create immediate paralysis. If decision-makers in Tehran understand from the first day that the renewed campaign will directly target the country's energy backbone, then the timeline, shaping their strategic calculations, compresses from months into a single day. That is why the Israeli position carries operational significance far beyond rhetoric. It is not simply an argument for escalation. It is a proposal for compression. Compress the timeline. Accelerate the arrival of institutional crisis by front-loading the strikes capable of inflicting the fastest and most irreversible economic damage. The reported support from several Arab countries confirms something equally important. The regional coalition accelerated after the Fujairah strike has now moved beyond symbolic political alignment and entered the phase of operational coordination. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and additional Gulf partners are no longer standing on the sidelines while waiting for diplomacy to succeed. Through bilateral consultations and joint military coordination meetings established after the Fujairah attack, these states are reportedly communicating their preferred structure for any resumed campaign directly to Washington. At the same time, another intelligence revelation emerged this morning, one with potentially enormous implications inside Iran itself. American intelligence assessments indicate that the injured designated supreme leader successor is actively participating in wartime strategic planning alongside senior Iranian leadership figures, despite remaining completely absent from public view. That assessment fundamentally changes the analytical picture created by earlier uncertainty surrounding whether Khamenei was even alive. According to the intelligence picture, he survived, but he is severely wounded. Public appearances are impossible. Nevertheless, he continues participating in strategic decisions alongside senior IRGC commanders operating from hardened underground bunkers across the country. The deeper importance of this intelligence lies in what it reveals about the current structure of decision-making inside the Islamic Republic. Mojtaba Khamenei is not functioning as an independent political strategist, competing with hardline IRGC commanders for influence over the direction of the war. He serves as the political instrument of the IRGC. Through him, the religious legitimacy attached to the institution of the supreme leader is transferred onto decisions the IRGC has already reached for institutional and military reasons. The power center is the IRGC itself. Khamenei functions as the voice that legitimizes those decisions inside the constitutional framework of the Velayat-e-Faqih system upon which the Islamic Republic is constructed. That distinction matters enormously for the ongoing negotiations. If the office of the Supreme Leader now operates primarily as a legitimizing mechanism rather than an independent authority center, then the civilian president's efforts to reclaim executive control and the foreign ministry's negotiations with external powers are ultimately being conducted by actors who do not possess final authority over the outcome. The IRGC holds that authority, and the IRGC has already publicly declared that a genuine agreement remains far from reality. This is the same institution Russia is currently rearming through the Caspian route. It is also the same institution that launched 15 ballistic missiles toward the UAE, while simultaneously describing American port strikes as violations of the ceasefire agreement. Ending this war while leaving the IRGC firmly in control of Iran would therefore preserve the underlying threat structure rather than remove it. The IRGC that governed Iran before February 28th spent decades financing proxy forces, expanding ballistic missile capabilities, advancing nuclear development efforts, and repeatedly threatening closure of the Strait of Hormuz. An agreement that leaves the organization institutionally intact would simply produce a weakened version of the same structure. Damaged? Yes. Destroyed? No. And over time, it would rebuild. It would reconstruct military capability according to the pace permitted by whatever framework agreement emerged, while retaining the institutional memory of surviving maximum American pressure. More importantly, it would absorb a dangerous lesson from the conflict. Survival itself becomes victory. If the organization can endure long enough, eventually the American domestic political equation changes. Pressure weakens, attention shifts, strategic priorities move elsewhere. That is precisely why Russia's weapons race through the Caspian Sea creates such extraordinary alarm beyond the immediate battlefield. Advantages those systems provide. Moscow is not merely helping the IRGC survive the next stage of combat. It is helping preserve the long-term institutional architecture of Iranian resistance itself. What Russia is truly delivering through the Caspian Sea is not just hardware. It is confidence. It is the institutional assurance the IRGC needs in order to believe continued resistance remains survivable. If the IRGC leadership concludes that Russian backing can carry them through this conflict, if the incoming manpads, drones, missile parts, and air defense systems create enough asymmetric lethality to impose painful costs on any renewed American operation, then the framework negotiations stop being the central priority. Survival becomes the priority. The talks become something else entirely. A delaying mechanism, a way to buy time while Moscow completes the weapons pipeline flowing south through the Caspian corridor. At the same moment, public flight tracking data visible this morning revealed an American military posture showing no indication whatsoever of reduced readiness. Multiple aerial refueling tankers were simultaneously airborne above Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. KC-135s maintained continuous orbital patterns across the region. Aircraft do not consume that level of fuel support without sustained operational activity underneath it. Something is flying long distances. Something requires constant refueling. Early warning aircraft also remained in the sky. The E-3 Century Airborne Battle Management System continued providing the integrated operational picture necessary for coordinating complex multi-platform missions at the tempo currently being maintained across the theater. Command and control aircraft remained active. So did surveillance platforms disguised as civilian traffic. Spy aircraft configured to resemble private business jets continued operating as part of a deliberate operational security strategy designed to conceal ISR collection activity beneath the appearance of ordinary commercial movement. Overt reconnaissance creates diplomatic exposure. Hidden reconnaissance avoids it. A refueling tanker near the Strait of Hormuz was observed flying repeated loops inside the Persian Gulf. Its mission was obvious: sustain the fighter aircraft enforcing the maritime blockade patrols. Over Baghdad, fighter activity remained constant. The Iraqi capital sits at the crossroads between Iran and nearly every neighboring state whose cooperation the current operational structure depends upon. It is a central airspace corridor in the wider regional architecture. Then came the images released by American forces themselves. An F-16 fighter appeared publicly in photographs, accompanied by a caption carefully designed to ensure observers understood the message. Not just any F-16, the CJ Wild Weasel variant. The specific aircraft responsible for suppression and destruction of enemy air defense preparation missions. The jet carried a full combat loadout, and the caption made the signal unmistakable. United States forces across the region remain mission ready. Meanwhile, another extraordinary indicator emerged from the Strait of Hormuz itself. 0 ships crossed the waterway during the previous 24 hours, not one. The maritime corridor through which roughly 20% of global oil moves every day had effectively stopped producing commercial transit traffic. Ship captains throughout the region appear to be reaching the same conclusion already demonstrated by the more than 57 vessels previously turned back, intercepted, or disabled while attempting blockade runs. The risk is too high. The cost of attempting passage has already been illustrated by what FA-18 strike aircraft are capable of doing to any vessel operating inside the Gulf of Oman. At the same time, the United Kingdom announced the redeployment of a warship toward the Middle East. That move completes another dimension of the coalition picture, the NATO dimension. For months, British public positioning toward American operations carried visible hesitation. Much of that caution was rooted in the financial interests surrounding Brent crude arbitrage and the economic incentives linked to Iranian oil flows. But that ambiguity now appears to be fading. The Fujairah strike accelerated the consolidation of Gulf state cooperation. The transit of the French carrier Charles de Gaulle toward the theater pointed in the same direction earlier. Now Britain is moving physically, not rhetorically. NATO states are beginning to align operationally instead of limiting themselves to diplomatic language. The British warship is therefore more than a deployment. It is the physical expression of a calculation that protecting freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz now serves British interests more directly than the financial advantages previously generated through energy market arbitrage tied to Iran. Then came the statement that framed nearly every other development occurring on May 9th. Donald Trump's comments regarding Project Freedom Plus. He was asked about Pakistan's request that Project Freedom not resume. Trump responded that Pakistan's president had indeed made that request, but he added that he believed Project Freedom was effective. Then he introduced the phrase that immediately shifted strategic attention across the region. Project Freedom Plus. He explained that if circumstances failed to improve, operations might return under this expanded framework. The wording carried deliberate ambiguity. The original Project Freedom centered around convoy escort operations. The addition of plus implied something broader, something larger, something intentionally undefined. And that ambiguity itself was the message. Project Freedom. Plus does not exist as a publicly published doctrine. No official operational handbook defines it. The phrase functions as diplomatic pressure language inside a maximum pressure strategy. Its purpose is psychological as much as military. The statement tells Tehran that if operations resume, the next phase will not resemble the previous stage of the conflict. It will become something more expansive, more aggressive, and potentially more devastating than before. The word plus forces IRGC planners into a dangerous guessing game. What exactly does it mean? Are Russian-supplied weapons sufficient to counter it? Several possible operational directions immediately emerge from that question. Expanded strike packages targeting Iranian coastal infrastructure, coordinating maritime harassment operations, direct American naval presence inside the Strait of Hormuz rather than maintaining primary positioning inside the Arabian Sea and Gulf of Oman. Enforcement attacks focused on the Iranian receiving points of the Caspian supply route, meaning ports and storage depots handling Russian shipments instead of attempts to intercept transit traffic at sea. Another possibility sits even deeper in the shadows. Direct action missions by Tier 1 forces stationed aboard the Ocean Trader near Diego Garcia against high-value targets identified through intelligence gathered during the ceasefire. Every one of those possibilities could fall under the meaning of plus. None require advanced public disclosure. The operational content of Project Freedom Plus is being shaped in real time by the same planning structure, supported by F-16 Wild Weasel sorties, AWACS battle management aircraft, and the constant orbital patterns of KC-135 refueling tankers. That creates the central paradox of the current ceasefire. Russia is using the pause to accelerate weapons deliveries through the Caspian Sea. But the United States is using that same pause for something else entirely. Positioning the Ocean Trader, preparing Wild Weasel suppression packages, maintaining a 3-carrier strike architecture at maximum capability, expanding coordination with Israel, Gulf Arab states, and NATO partners, allowing the blockade's economic pressure to continue building toward the 3 to 4 month threshold identified in CIA assessments. But there is one major difference between the two preparations. Russian activity is visible, American preparation is not. The evidence of Moscow's support can be counted and tracked openly. 8 white aircraft above Zanjan, cargo movements across Caspian routes, drones, missile components, and air defense systems moving toward Iranian depots. American preparation appears differently. It reveals itself through tanker flight patterns, carrier positioning, intelligence signatures, aircraft movements. But the actual operational content remains hidden behind transponder dark military flights and deliberately ambiguous political language like Project Freedom Plus. That imbalance in visibility is not accidental. It is strategic. Russia is making its support obvious because Moscow wants Tehran to see the reassurance. The Kremlin wants the IRGC to believe continued resistance remains viable. It wants Washington to understand that any renewed campaign will confront an Iranian adversary more heavily armed than the force degraded during the first phase of fighting. The American side operates differently. Tier 1 missions and precision strike planning cannot coexist with public transparency about methods, targets, timing, or operational sequencing. Secrecy is not optional, it is foundational. The IRGC therefore confronts two realities simultaneously. It sees Russian weapons arriving, and it sees signs that something major may be forming on the American side without being able to determine exactly what that something is. That uncertainty now surrounds the decision regarding the framework's 30-day bridge mechanism. Russian weapons shipments make resistance appear survivable, but the hidden meaning behind Project Freedom Plus leaves open the possibility that the next phase of this conflict may look nothing like the last one. If you want more deep strategic breakdowns and battlefield analysis like this, stay connected and keep following the unfolding developments. Because the next moves in this conflict may redefine the balance of power across the entire region.